April 1944. In a secure room beneath London, a British intelligence officer slides a photograph across a mahogany table. The image shows a sprawling industrial complex in central Germany, smokestacks rising against a pale sky, rail lines converging like arteries. Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal leans forward, studying the synthetic fuel plant at Luna with an intensity that makes the younger officers shift in their seats. For 4 years, Britain had dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on German cities and factories. For 4 years, the Luftwaffe kept flying. German tanks kept rolling. The Wehrmacht kept fighting. But this photograph, and dozens like it spread across the table, represented something different. Not another target in an endless list, but potentially the target. The single point of failure in Hitler's entire war machine. Portal's finger traces the outline of the hydrogenation towers. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of a man who has sent thousands of airmen to their deaths, and knows he will send thousands more. "Gentlemen," he says, "I believe we've been hitting the wrong targets." The realization didn't arrive as a sudden epiphany. It accumulated slowly, piece by piece, through the painstaking work of analysts in the Ministry of Economic Warfare who spent their days studying production figures, railway manifests, and reconnaissance photographs. They had known for years that Germany produced almost no natural petroleum. The Reich had no Texas oil fields, no Middle Eastern reserves, no vast deposits beneath its soil. What Germany had was coal, and the scientific ingenuity to transform that coal into synthetic fuel through a complex chemical process developed in the 1920s. By 1940, Germany operated dozens of synthetic fuel plants across the Reich and occupied territories. These facilities, using the Fischer-Tropsch and Burgers processes, could produce roughly 4 million tons of fuel annually. Add Romania's Ploiești fields, which provided another 1.8 million tons, and Germany had just enough petroleum to keep its military machine functioning. Just enough, but no margin for error, no reserve for a prolonged war, no buffer against sustained attack. British intelligence had documented this vulnerability in reports dating back to 1940. The Ministry of Economic Warfare maintained detailed files on every known synthetic plant, tracking production estimates, identifying key facilities, mapping the fragile network that kept German vehicles and aircraft operational. But knowing about a vulnerability and acting on it were two different things. For years, the knowledge sat in filing cabinets while British bombers struck other targets, following other strategies, pursuing other theories of how to break German industrial power. The problem was one of faith and momentum. By 1943, Bomber Command had committed itself to a strategy of area bombing, the systematic destruction of German cities intended to break civilian morale and disrupt industrial production generally. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris believed in this approach with religious fervor, convinced that enough destruction spread across enough cities would eventually bring Germany to its knees. Oil plants were just another target type in a vast catalogue of German industrial capacity. But in early 1944, the calculations began to shift. American strategic bombing forces had joined the campaign in strength, bringing different doctrines and fresh perspectives. The Americans favored precision daylight bombing of specific industrial targets rather than British night area raids. This philosophical difference created friction, but it also opened space for new thinking about what targets actually mattered most. The Ministry of Economic Warfare analysts had been making their case quietly for months. Their reports documented something striking. German fuel production operated at maximum capacity, with virtually no reserve. The synthetic plants ran constantly, producing just enough to meet military needs. Romania's Ploiești fields pumped at full output. There was no stockpile, no strategic reserve, no cushion. If production dropped even 20%, German military operations would face immediate constraints. If production dropped 50%, the Wehrmacht would begin to grind to a halt. In March 1944, a colonel from the Ministry of Economic Warfare presented these findings to a planning committee that included representatives from both British and American strategic air forces. He spread charts across the conference table showing German fuel production and consumption. The numbers told an unambiguous story. Germany needed roughly 300,000 tons of aviation fuel per month to maintain current operational levels. The synthetic plants and Romanian imports provided approximately that amount, sometimes slightly more, sometimes slightly less, but always close to the minimum required. Destroy 30% of their production capacity, the colonel said, his finger tapping the chart, and the Luftwaffe cuts training flights. Destroy 50% and they begin grounding squadrons. Destroy 70% and German armor divisions become immobile fortifications. The room went quiet. An American general leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling. A British air commodore lit his pipe, smoke curling toward the overhead lights. Everyone present understood what the numbers implied. They had been bombing Germany for years, dropping millions of tons of explosives on cities and factories, fighting through flak and fighters, losing thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men. And perhaps the most efficient way to cripple German military power had been sitting in intelligence files all along, waiting for someone to act on it. But recognition wasn't the same as consensus. Air Chief Marshal Harris remained skeptical. He had built Bomber Command into a massive force optimized for night area bombing. His crews trained for it, his tactics assumed it, his entire operational framework depended on it. Shifting to precision attacks on specific industrial targets meant changing everything, adopting methods he had spent years arguing against. The synthetic fuel plants were small, hardened targets, difficult to hit accurately, heavily defended. Area bombing was proven. Oil targeting was theory. The debate that followed consumed weeks of meetings, memoranda, and increasingly tense exchanges between British and American commanders. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, became the strongest advocate for the oil plan. He studied the Ministry of Economic Warfare reports and reached the same conclusion the analysts had. Oil was Germany's critical vulnerability, the one resource whose loss would paralyze the entire military machine more effectively than any amount of general industrial destruction. Portal found himself caught between competing visions. He respected Harris's achievements and understood the institutional momentum behind area bombing, but he also saw the logic in the oil targeting strategy. More importantly, he saw the intelligence reports coming from occupied Europe, documents that suggested German fuel supplies were already strained. Luftwaffe training had been cut back. German armored divisions conserved fuel. The indicators were there for anyone willing to read them. On April 19, 1944, Portal made his decision. The Strategic Air Forces would implement a systematic campaign against German oil production, not as an experiment or a temporary diversion, but as the primary targeting priority. Synthetic fuel plants would receive top priority, with Ploesti's Romanian fields as a secondary target. The campaign would begin immediately, coordinated between British night bombers and American daylight forces, sustained until German fuel production collapsed. Harris received the order with barely concealed frustration. In a letter to Portal, he argued that oil targeting would divert resources from the proven strategy of area bombing, that the synthetic plants were too difficult to hit effectively, that the campaign would cost more than it achieved. But Portal was chief of the air staff, and his orders stood. Bomber Command would participate in the oil campaign. On May 12, 1944, 935 American bombers struck synthetic fuel plants across Germany in the largest coordinated attack on oil targets yet attempted. The formations hit facilities at Leuna, Bohlen, Zeitz, Brucks, and Politz. Flak batteries threw up walls of explosive shells. German fighters rose to intercept. 46 American bombers went down, their crews killed or captured. but reconnaissance photographs taken the following day showed extensive damage to multiple plants. Production at Luna, Germany's largest synthetic fuel facility, dropped by 75% overnight. The campaign continued through the summer. British bombers struck oil targets at night. American formations attacked by day. The synthetic plants, with their distinctive hydrogenation towers and sprawling industrial complexes, became the most bombed targets in Germany. Plant managers worked frantically to repair damage, but the attacks came too frequently. A facility would restore production to 50% capacity, then another raid would knock it back to 20%. The Germans rebuilt. The Allies bombed again. A grinding war of attrition played out in fire and high explosive. By June, British intelligence analysts began seeing confirmation in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. A Luftwaffe pilot shot down over France told his interrogators that his squadron had cut training flights by half. A German tank officer captured in Normandy mentioned fuel shortages affecting his division's mobility. These were anecdotal reports, individual data points, but they accumulated into a pattern. In July, the Ministry of Economic Warfare issued an assessment based on reconnaissance photographs and intelligence from occupied territory. German synthetic fuel production had dropped to approximately 170,000 tons per month, down from over 300,000 tons before the campaign began. Aviation fuel production had fallen even more sharply, to roughly 54,000 tons monthly. The Luftwaffe needed at least 160,000 tons per month to maintain operational capability. The numbers spoke clearly. Germany was running out of fuel. Portal read the report in his office overlooking the Thames. Outside, London was preparing for the cross-channel invasion, the massive operation that would determine whether the war ended in 1944 or dragged on for years. The oil campaign had been running for 2 months. Hundreds of bombers had been lost. Thousands of airmen were dead or in POW camps. But the strategy was working. The numbers proved it. He called a meeting of the strategic bombing commanders. When they gathered, Portal placed the Ministry of Economic Warfare report on the table. "Gentlemen," he said, "we appear to have found their Achilles' heel." The evidence continued to accumulate through August. Luftwaffe sortie rates dropped noticeably. German fighters that had once risen in hundreds to challenge Allied bomber formations now appeared in dozens. Not because the Germans lacked aircraft or pilots, but because they lacked fuel to fly them. Reconnaissance flights over German airfields showed fighters parked in neat rows, unused, while Allied bombers passed overhead. The Luftwaffe was dying of thirst with water all around it. Aircraft grounded while fuel production crumbled under sustained bombing. On August 10th, American bombers struck the Ploesti oil fields in Romania with 376 aircraft. The raid destroyed much of the refining capacity and damaged wells across the complex. Romania was producing roughly 130,000 tons of fuel monthly, a critical supplement to German synthetic production. The Ploesti raid cut that output by more than half. Combined with the ongoing destruction of synthetic plants inside Germany, the attack pushed German fuel availability below the critical threshold. British intelligence intercepted German communications showing the impact. A Wehrmacht logistics officer reported to his headquarters that fuel allocations for September would be cut by 40%. A Luftwaffe training command memo suspended all advanced pilot training due to fuel shortages. An armored division commander requested permission to move his tanks by rail rather than drive them to their deployment area, citing insufficient fuel for a road march. These weren't the communications of an army under pressure. They were the communications of an army beginning to run out of fuel. In September, Portal received a report from the Combined Strategic Targets Committee summarizing the oil campaign's progress. German synthetic fuel production had fallen to approximately 107,000 tons per month. Aviation fuel production was down to 23,000 tons monthly. Total petroleum availability, including Romanian imports and remaining stockpiles, amounted to roughly 150,000 tons per month. German military forces needed at minimum 250,000 tons monthly to maintain current operational levels. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Germany was consuming fuel faster than it could produce it, drawing down reserves that would be exhausted within months. The Wehrmacht was running on fumes. Portal shared the report with Churchill. The Prime Minister read it in silence, then looked up. "How confident are we in these figures?" "Very confident, Prime Minister. Multiple intelligence sources confirm the production estimates. We're seeing the effects in German operational patterns. The Luftwaffe has essentially ceded air superiority over Germany. Armored divisions are conserving fuel. Training has been cut drastically." Churchill set down the report. "Then we continue the campaign." "Without question." Through October and November, the oil campaign intensified. British and American bombers struck every identified synthetic plant repeatedly. The Germans defended these facilities with concentrated flak batteries and fighter squadrons, making the raids among the most dangerous of the war. Bomber losses over oil targets ran higher than almost any other target type, but the attacks continued because the intelligence made clear they were working. By December, German fuel production had collapsed to roughly 35,000 tons per month. Aviation fuel production was effectively zero, with the Luftwaffe receiving only small quantities refined from remaining stockpiles. The numbers were so low that British intelligence analysts initially questioned them, suspecting their sources had made errors. But multiple independent intelligence streams confirmed the figures. Germany's oil production had been reduced to a fraction of what it needed. The impact became visible in German military operations. When Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Wehrmacht's last major attack in the West, German planning documents captured after the battle showed that fuel shortages had constrained every aspect of the operation. Panzer divisions received enough fuel to advance approximately 60 miles, after which they were expected to capture Allied fuel dumps to continue. The entire offensive was planned around the assumption that German tanks would run out of fuel and need to steal more from the enemy to keep moving. British intelligence officers reading these captured documents understood what they meant. The Wehrmacht wasn't just low on fuel. It was so desperately short that it planned major operations around the hope of capturing enemy supplies. This was the military equivalent of a starving man planning a robbery to get food. It wasn't strategy. It was desperation. In January 1945, Portal received an intelligence summary that quantified the oil campaign's success with stark clarity. German synthetic fuel production had fallen to approximately 21,000 tons per month. Aviation fuel production was effectively nil. The Luftwaffe had grounded most of its remaining aircraft. German armored divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel. Training of new pilots and tank crews had stopped entirely. The Wehrmacht was being strangled by its empty fuel tanks. Portal read the report, then called in his chief intelligence officer. "Is it possible," he asked, "that we're overestimating the impact, that Germany has hidden reserves we don't know about?" The intelligence officer shook his head. "We've considered that possibility extensively, sir. Our estimates are based on production facility damage, which we can verify through reconnaissance photographs. We're also seeing the operational effects across the board. Every indicator confirms the same thing. Germany has run out of oil. How long can they continue? They're running on fumes now, sir. Whatever small reserves remain will be exhausted within weeks. After that, their military forces will be effectively immobile, except where they can move by rail or on foot." Portal sat back in his chair. For 5 years, Britain had fought Germany. For 5 years, the question had been how to defeat an enemy that seemed capable of absorbing endless punishment and continuing to fight. The answer, it turned out, had been there all along in the intelligence files. Germany's military power rested on a foundation of synthetic fuel plants and Romanian oil fields. Destroy that foundation, and the entire structure collapsed. By February 1945, the collapse was complete. German synthetic fuel production had fallen to approximately 17,000 tons per month. The Luftwaffe flew only a handful of sorties. German tanks sat immobile in defensive positions, unable to maneuver for lack of fuel. Wehrmacht units moved by horse cart and bicycle. The most mechanized military force in the world had been reduced to the mobility of a 19th-century army. British intelligence officers compiled a final assessment in March 1945. The document, stamped "Most Secret" and distributed only to the highest levels of command, laid out the oil campaign's results with bureaucratic precision. German fuel production had been reduced by 94% from its 1944 peak. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The Wehrmacht was immobilized. German military effectiveness had been reduced by an estimated 70% solely due to lack of fuel, separate from any other factors like personnel losses or equipment destruction. Portal read the assessment and thought about the 4 years of debate, the arguments over targeting priorities, the resistance from commanders committed to other strategies. The oil campaign had run for less than a year. In that time, it had accomplished what years of area bombing had not: the systematic destruction of Germany's ability to wage mechanized warfare. The final vindication came from German sources. After the war, interrogations of German military leaders and industrialists confirmed what British intelligence had concluded. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, stated flatly that the oil campaign had been decisive. "The enemy struck us at our weakest point," he said. "The fuel plants were the foundation of our entire war production. Once they were destroyed, everything else became irrelevant." Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior commanders, was more direct. Asked what had defeated the Wehrmacht, he replied, "3 things: Russian manpower, American industrial production, and the loss of our fuel supplies. Of those 3, the fuel shortage was the most immediately crippling." In London, Portal received these post-war assessments with quiet satisfaction. The oil campaign had cost hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen. The losses had been heavy, the raids dangerous, the results sometimes uncertain. But the strategy had worked. British intelligence had identified Germany's critical vulnerability. British and American bombers had exploited it, and German military power had collapsed as a result. The lesson was clear, though it had taken years to learn. Modern mechanized warfare ran on petroleum. An army without fuel was an army without mobility, without air support, without the ability to concentrate forces or exploit opportunities. Germany had built the most powerful military machine in Europe, but it had built that machine on a foundation of synthetic fuel plants that could be destroyed from the air. British High Command had realized, finally and completely, that Germany was running out of oil. More importantly, they had realized it in time to act on that knowledge, to shift strategy, to focus bombing resources on the targets that mattered most. The realization had come slowly, resisted by institutional momentum and competing theories of strategic bombing. But once it came, once the intelligence was clear and the decision made, the campaign had unfolded with brutal effectiveness. In the end, Germany's military defeat had many causes: Soviet resistance, American industrial power, British determination, German strategic errors. But among those causes, the loss of oil stood out for its immediacy and completeness. The Wehrmacht didn't slowly weaken. It was strangled, its mobility cut off, its air force grounded, its mechanized divisions reduced to static positions. All because British intelligence officers had studied production figures and reconnaissance photographs, because analysts had made their case persistently, because commanders had eventually listened, and because bomber crews had flown into heavy flak to destroy synthetic fuel plants deep in Germany. The war ended in May 1945. By then, German fuel production had effectively ceased. The mighty Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 sat immobile, out of fuel, unable to move even if it had somewhere to go. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized London and fought for air superiority over Britain was grounded, its aircraft parked uselessly on airfields. The panzer divisions that had revolutionized armored warfare were static fortifications, their tanks unable to maneuver. British High Command had said many things when they realized Germany was running out of oil. They had debated strategy, argued over priorities, questioned intelligence estimates, and resisted changing established doctrine. But in the end, they had said the only thing that mattered: attack the oil. And in doing so, they had found the way to break German military power more effectively than any other campaign of the war.